So now, for the evening's program, I want to turn the stage over to our distinguished guests, and please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. I count it a real privilege to be sharing this very strange moment with all of you and with Bina. I mean, I was saying to Bina, we must remember that the audience will pretend to be listening, but they're really thinking about the coronavirus and the stock market. And we're not going to get into this, but into our politics coming up empty in a moment of huge challenge and stress. You've heard about Bina's book, and you may have read her editorial endorsing Elizabeth Warren in the Globe this week. Also a wonderful TV, a wonderful video sort of explaining how they came to the decision. I think of this conversation as I like to think of a lot of conversations on the radio, is I imagine myself buckling in for a flight to Chicago, and I turn, and in the next seat, there's Bina. And I'm thinking, wow, I just read your book. Can we talk? And we'll be over in an hour and 15 minutes or whatever, but let's have some fun. That is the spirit of this conversation. We've never done this before. I have read the book with great interest. I will say at the start, Bina, I began reading it well before coronavirus, but even as I read it, I thought, she's not worried enough. She's not as worried as I am about what we're talking about. But let's just plunge. How are we feeling in this coronavirus moment?
Well, so I met a guy on the beach once in St. Lucia who said, I said I was worried about something, and he said, don't worry, worry makes you small. Be concerned. So I'm concerned, but I'm not yet in full panic mode. And I do, some of the ideas in the book include, how do we level-headedly look at the warning signs around us and feel a sense of agency to make decisions, not just panic, right? Because when you panic, it often means you turn off the potential of the future and you think, that doomsday is coming. I don't really want to think about that. I'm just going to turn back to the present moment and the cocktail in hand or whatever that might be. So how are we doing right now with the coronavirus? How are we feeling?
How are we feeling? My kids are calling me up, all women well into their 40s, midlife, with kids, and thinking they've never been so scared. But I say, well, I'm scared too, but what is this strange suspension of understanding?
I think part of the challenge we're having right now is that a lot of us don't feel that we can trust our leaders to handle this problem. So I think there are people, you're hearing about people in authoritarian China who are worried about, who are under quarantine and who are, whose information is being controlled, but who are still trying to get messages across to each other across the lines of quarantine amid censorship. And I think here we have a very different situation where we have a president who's up for re-election who is clearly panicking about the stock market dive, which is historic, as the worst stock market dive we've had since the 2008 financial crisis, and has put in charge of the response a person who is a notorious denier of evidence-based policy, who oversaw an HIV outbreak in Indiana, has been against the HPV vaccine, and they are trying to control the message from their own Centers for Disease Control about this epidemic, possible pandemic, potential pandemic. And so I think what we're seeing is, I think one reason the stock market is diving so precipitously is that people don't have trust in the response at the government level to this crisis. And I think the messages are also mixed. You have CDC leaders saying, take this seriously, prepare, and then you have the president at a press conference saying there's a very low risk, when we shouldn't be saying that yet because we don't actually have enough testing to know how prevalent it is yet in the US. So how am I feeling? I feel that this has been a long time coming. It's not just about this moment and whether we respond. It's about the way the CDC budget, the Centers for Disease Control budget, was slashed in 2018, and that was done, under this White House. It's about, during the Ebola epidemic, between 2014 and 2015, there was a big surge in our global health security funding at the national level. So it rose from about $500 million to over $1 billion. And it has now dropped down below that $500 million threshold. The National Security Council team that responds to epidemics was disbanded by this president in 2018. So we are not in a situation where we've been preparing for and doing the things we would normally do, some of the studies that would be happening between US physicians and physicians in China to look at how bad this threat was early on, didn't happen. So we are in a situation that kind of proves the subtitle of the book, right? We are in a reckless age where suddenly there's a desire to respond and fix the problem, but there were many things that could have been done earlier to shore up our potential to respond to this problem. And so I think that's sort of, to me, it's like one of those, it goes into the playbook of motivations for writing this book, right? I was getting frustrated by the ways that we don't prepare for the future, whether that's as individuals or as societies, and trying to figure out, well, why don't we, and what can make that better, and what are the examples of where we have actually done so that can be sort of models for the future.
I love your line from Thoreau, that we must learn, we have to learn to live in this time by the rules of long time.
The experience in my life that sort of defines that for me was when I was thinking about this book in the early stages. I was visiting my grandmother in India, and she gave me an instrument that had belonged to her father. And because he had given this instrument called a dilruba, it's a string instrument with many strings played with a bow, a very beautiful, melancholic instrument. Because he had given it to my grandmother, it survived. And when she gave it to me, it was sort of like this passing of the torch, and it made me think of myself in a new way. It was obviously me being her descendant, her telling me, like, I want you to have this very important thing that survived from my father. But also, I began to think of myself more as an ancestor, and to think of myself according to the laws of the long time, and to try to understand what my role is, how I would pass this forward, how I would shepherd this in time. And I think that kind of thinking about one's legacy tends to kick in later in life. And so for me, getting this instrument in my, I'm wondering, are you thinking about that?
Nothing but.
Yeah, and so, one thing for me that has been really important and that led to this book was to start to think of myself in this way as an ancestor now, earlier in my life, so that what I do and how I measure myself is not by what I've accomplished in a given week, but is more based on what I'm leaving for the future and how I can measure that by what I'll have to pass on. And so that the idea of an heirloom, and an heirloom being sort of the goal is to leave heirlooms, then became a metaphor for thinking about how we can do that not just in our lives and our families, but how can we do that in our communities and our society? How do we leave shared heirlooms, collective heirlooms to the future? Because I think that's really a powerful way for us to act better as better ancestors. And I found examples of that, including fisheries, a fishery in Mexico, where I spent time across these 8 villages that have essentially collaborated to protect the lobster fishery in the region as if it's a shared heirloom. So they self-police the fishery. The government doesn't really police that region very well. They measure their catch very carefully, and generation to generation, they're passing on the practice of fishing, and it's a very different story than the East Coast lobster fisheries of Mexico, where there's been a lot of rampant overfishing and sort of that classic fish story you hear of overfishing. And so I was just very interested in that and their idea of passing on this way of life and this industry and, in fact, the resource they have, and to think of that like a shared heirloom. And, of course, in this country we have national parks, which are another example of that. And so it started to get, and that sort of got me thinking about, well, what does it mean? What do you need to create a shared heirloom? For one, it can't be everything, right? Just like every object in your great-grandfather's basement is not going to be an heirloom. I only had one to choose from, but you pick things that are precious resources in a community. What's sacred to you? What do you think will be relevant to people across time, whether or not they develop AI or gene editing tools or technology transforms their lifestyle? What is it that has lasted through time to now that has been important to human beings? And that gives you a clue about what might persist in importance in the future. And then can you establish rules around it? So in national parks obviously have formal laws protecting them and resources with that. And in the case of these Mexican fisheries in Baja California, there were informal rules protecting and agreements among these communities about how to protect that shared heirloom. And then I think really importantly, meaning. That each generation has to have a sense of meaning from that resource, and it has to be interacted with. It can't just be a time capsule buried for future generations. That, if you had a whole generation, say, of Americans who didn't go to the national parks, who didn't go to the Grand Canyon, who didn't go to Acadia, then if a president wanted to come along and just get rid of the national park system, right, you wouldn't have an outcry. You wouldn't have that sense of it being an important part of our cultural heritage. So I think for something to be a shared heirloom, the sense of it having meaning to each generation has to be carried forth.
I'm just thinking of those. It was a wonderful story about the Mexican fishermen, but I'm thinking we're in a fishery right here in Rockport, hard by Gloucester, and I wouldn't begin to. I probably shouldn't go there, but this is a very sensitive matter. I've talked to fishermen in Karachi in Pakistan. They deal with the same incredible dilemma. But what is the lesson for what used to be the fishery of this continent, Gloucester, Massachusetts? I mean,
yeah, I wish there were more heirloom thinking here. And I think one thing that's happening, there's a sort of policy way to address this, right? If a community doesn't decide to do it of their own sort of volition, sometimes they need another tool to do this. And I spent some time talking to fishermen in Galveston, Texas, the commercial red snapper fishery there. In about 2004, 2005, it was almost decimated. It was almost completely destroyed. And it's been brought back through a system called cat shares that basically makes all the fishing businesses that have been there into long-term investors, so their share of the fishery grows as the fishery comes back, and it's rebounded as a result of that. Now they have a different problem with recreational fishing. But this has been tried in about 22 fisheries in North America and has been shown to actually slow the race to fish. It's an innovation in how people come together and in making people they would never call themselves ancestors or keepers of a shared heirloom, but I think of it as a way to make our institutions do what sometimes people can do serendipitously, but sometimes we can't.
Interesting. I want to come back somehow to the coronavirus mood we're in. And not just gloom and doom. There's going to be a huge cultural lesson from this whole thing, and we don't really know what it's going to be, but it's going to reinforce your whole puzzlement of why we are so reckless. We know so much about the consequences of things, and we plow right ahead. In the case of the coronavirus, I mean, it's interesting. I find, Lyft drivers and plain people on the street, immediately, I mean, we want to do this, find some meaning in it. And one immediate meaning is that God is pissed off and he's a warning. But then another version of it comes as sort of, and semi-scientific, that Mother Nature is telling us again, no, you've gone too far. You're pushing, you're crowding the animals on this planet and forcing into circulation the animal reservoirs of bugs that we cannot handle, but that there is a meaning to it. I guess the simple question is, the question of your book is, why are we so damn reckless? And I think we're more reckless than not. But what meaning should we take? Should we look for and then would be ready to accept for ourselves as a lesson of this scare? Let's hope it's no more than a scare. But we're being told something.
I think part of what we're being told is that we need leaders who will look at science, right? Who will look at scientific information, and that we also need to be able to trust our leadership not to misinform us. I think we all have the agency we have in this situation is to elect someone different, but that's part of our agency, and but we're not here, we're here in Massachusetts, we're not in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, right? But we still have agency, and there's ways we can all influence that. But I think until we see how this plays out, I think it's important also to keep a measure, I do think it's important to keep a measure of calm but open eyes about this, because as a cultural phenomenon, right, there are moments where we realize there's an outbreak and then we deal with them, and the global community deals with them, the World Health Organization and the countries that participate in that deal with them. And I think one thing that we know about our when we do think ahead, or when we're able to engage with threats in the future, it's often by each being able to do our part. And so one of the reasons I think people have trouble acting on climate change, even if they know it's a problem, is they feel powerless. They don't feel like there's anything they can do. And that's one reason why, I think the CDC, puts out guidelines around washing your hands and avoiding contact, right? It's even more important than masks, right, is to avoid contact and sort of that close face contact, and thoroughly washing your hands for 20 seconds, all those things that just seem so kind of pedestrian, but they're really important, I think, because they give people the sense that they can engage with what's happening and that they have some agency or power or control over their part of the world. And I think for me, that's one of the things in the toolkit of thinking ahead, is finding those areas where you can engage, because they become a sort of gateway drug to being able to deal with the bigger scope of the problem when you have at least some component of it that you feel is in your control. There's so many interesting things about epidemics and sort of what emerges from them culturally. Just even the existence of spittoons, and that going back to the influenza epidemic of 1918.
Remind us, tell us this spittoon story.
Well, I don't know too much about it. Basically that's the headline of it, but just that people, right, the whole idea of not spitting in the street really emerged from the 1918 influenza epidemic, and how people realized that that was not a very good habit for when you have a contagious disease around that's killing people. There's a long history of quarantines that the whole concept dates back to Italy, but been used, right, in many different circumstances. Typhoid Mary, obviously being used now in Liberia. Quarantines were used during the Ebola epidemic. And there's a varied history of them and their effectiveness, and often they lead people to be sneaky and to sort of underreporting of disease or stigmatization of certain kind of people, and you have to be really careful about using quarantines as a public health tool. I don't know exactly how expansive our response is going to become. We don't know how this virus might change and become less or more either deadly, contagious. So there are many ways when you're dealing with a living organism, that things can change. And I just feel that it's important not to, at the same time as we shouldn't, the New Yorker cover next week's gonna have the face mask on Donald Trump's eyes. As much as we shouldn't do that, we should also not, completely panic, I think. So I think it's one of the lessons of the book, I think, is that the way to prepare for the future and be able to deal with the future is to be able to look at it with clear eyes and imagine ways that you can deal with future scenarios. So think through future scenarios, think about what you'll do in those scenarios, think about what your community will do, and just use those practical paths or options that you have as a way of engaging with the possibilities.
I can't help wondering about, we all know people whose flights to various places have been canceled, to China and otherwise, or who have decided not to go there anyway. But there's going to be a huge trickle-down effect, I think, on this already puzzling surge of so-called nationalism, the sense that we never should have let those jobs go anyway. We got to get them back. Supply lines are important in war. They're important in a society.
Yeah.
All that's going to be reconsidered. I can easily imagine. I mean,
if this gets
Trump
really
could be-
bad here, I could see that. I could see some of that national production, that idea that we should have supply chains for medicines and medical supplies more readily available here. But one thing that's really interesting, right? Like you'll probably hear that coming from the Trump White House if this gets as bad as some people think it will. But the national stockpile of medicines was moved out of the Centers for Disease Control in 2018. And that was a place where it was more readily available to disseminate to local health departments. It was put into another department at Health and Human Services that is more subject to lobbying by different companies that want to offer those supplies to our government to procure. So there has been a lot of things happening already that have set us up to not do as well in this epidemic that I think are really important to keep in mind, because this is in human nature. It's in the nature of our politics to celebrate people who respond to the crisis in the moment. Rudy Giuliani, on the ashes of the World Trade Center after 9/11, became Time Person of the Year, and that's because he was there to respond to the disaster. We don't celebrate the people who prepare for and avoid the disaster because we don't get to see the disaster not happening. But I think there's a lot that we need to try to understand about the history and try to keep an awareness of about why this has happened, why this is unfolding the way it is.
Right. I've seen that Trump with the mask cover of the New Yorker. I mean, you can imagine the doctor-in-chief flunks entirely. This is the end of his career. You can also imagine a surge in, or him playing it as a surge of national interest. Immediately, some people were ready to put it into score it in a U.S.-China combat. But a lot to be wary of. Would you speak? I'd love to hear more from you, Bina, on journalism. What you want to do at the Globe. It's a time of journalism on the ropes in so many ways. Corporations on the ropes, local newspapers on the ropes, if not gone. How do all of us in journalism get the audience back? And
I should be asking you this because
well,
you've
you've
innovated in this way. I think it's a huge challenge. Yeah. How to get the audience back is the question, right?
No, and I'm thinking a million years before you, but I knew the Globe inside out and worked there, and then the New York Times and the Washington Bureau. So the whole public discussion fascinates me, what people know and don't know, what they don't want to know, what they're doing when they're not reading the newspaper. I pine for, that that era of a much more institutionally respected, not perfect, but the New York Times of the 50s and 60s, when I was in college and thinking of a career, was an incredibly impressive place, led by James Reston and others. But the Anthony Lewis, Tom Wicker, and a marvelous time in American journalism. And these places are just fighting for air now and fighting to survive. What are we going to do about what the public knows and wants to know?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's true that people aren't seeking information. I think they're two separate questions. Like, are people seeking information and getting credible information? Do what they want to pay for it? And what's their expectation around what it costs? So that's sort of like a separate question, which is threatening the business model, but which then threatens the ability of these organizations to invest in as much journalism as they could. Of course, a lot of media organizations are experiencing a sort of Trump bump, right? Like from where they were before this president was elected. The Washington Post, right? Every time the president attacks the Washington Post, they get more subscribers. And so you have to kind of realize that we're in this
And every time they attack
ecosystem.
him, he gets more voters or something.
Who knows? I don't know. So I think one of the challenges, I think, is to not just be there's so much to watch in this administration, there's so much to be outraged about, and we need to track all of that, but not just to be sort of manufacturing outrage and being part of that, even though that's getting a lot of readers. And then I do really want to hear your thoughts on this, but I also think that, especially being in Boston, we have the ability to showcase, the world's leading ideas, but also the biggest questions about those ideas, whether they are technologies that we're concerned about, or whether I feel like the next generation's in the room with us right now, so to be able to have those questions be raised in the pages of your newspaper, so it's not just incremental and sort of like whatever's in the news today, but it's actually the news organizations or the journalistic products that you're reading or consuming, whether you're watching them or you're listening to a podcast or whatever that is, are helping you make meaning and context out of that daily churn, and also helping you cast your eyes further to the horizon about what's actually coming that's interesting. So one thing I'm interested in doing with Globe Opinion and Globe Ideas is showcasing solutions, for one. In what instances is Massachusetts or Boston or New England a microcosm of solving an intractable problem that could be a model for how the world solves those problems? And in what instances are we a microcosm of the problem itself, right? Racial wealth gaps in Boston, for example, just staggering. And so what can we learn about the way that people are talking about that problem here that makes it sort of is the connection between us and the wider world? And that I feel like is an interesting way to think of our identity, as opposed to just navel-gazing or looking only at ourselves and saying all we care about is our turf of the world. It's rather, we care about our turf of the world because we are connected to, and we are a mirror or an echo of what's happening in many other places. And for example, we're running an editorial series right now about Newton, Massachusetts, which is the affluent suburb of Boston, and a movement there that is happening to essentially create more affordable housing developments. And it's very controversial. There might be people in this room who are against these developments, but we are editorializing, we're watching what Newton is doing because it's so unconventional. The idea is that Newton itself, in most communities across this country, like Newton, which are affluent suburbs where people own houses and they don't want those property values to drop, they aren't as open to these developments because the developments bring in more people, they could affect property values, bring in different kinds of people, different races, different demographics socioeconomically, and the schools start to change, the kids in the public schools are changed. And so there is a contingent there. I'm not going to pretend there's not people who are fighting these developments, but there's also this movement of people trying to get this done, not because it's in their self-interest, but because they don't want to be a community that shuts these people out. And so that, to me, is a really interesting issue to track for us as the Globe Opinion section, because we're showcasing and we're trying to hold them to a higher ideal. We want them to do these things, and we're saying, look at what you're doing. That's really interesting, and that could be a model for how the problems in America's cities where there's not enough affordable housing could be solved. The question is, how do you get voice and just facts, right? Can you get voice and not sort of polemics? And I think that's sort of for the other side of the paper to figure out, not me.
I love your take, and I think your instincts are so right, to find a new voice. To me, I filed a coronavirus as one more little indication that the lives we have made as human beings are unsustainable in the long run, and that we took one little step in consciousness closer. But I put it as a general question to Bina, it is sort of the problem of your book. I mean, sort of how do we see ahead and avoid the disaster? Is it avoidable, I guess?
Sometimes. And we don't see the future perfectly, right? So that's the other thing. There are unknowable things about the future, and that's just unsettling. But we are capable of more than we're doing right now. That is the reason for my optimism, is knowing we have choices. And when we pair political will with science and technology and ingenuity, and with coming together collectively to decide to do things, we are capable of a lot. And I'll go back to that example of HIV, where it was a death sentence in this country, and it is no longer that way. People live with this condition, and it was medical innovation, it was political activists coming together, it was the government deciding they would get these experimental drugs out into the population, coming together to respond to something, to solve a problem. And so there are examples of, and there are many in the book, of people looking ahead, using that capacity to plan for the future. And so I think, I don't know if we will do it, if we will just perish like the people of Pompeii in the shadow of Vesuvius, right? If our civilization, I don't know. But I am optimistic because I think we have the option to do far better.
Thank you.
Thanks.